The center next semester will be mostly online. All the talks will be online, and we will start on January 19th at noon for a center debates, and the theme will be the center debates COVID. And we will have our colleagues at Pitt, Jonathan Fuller, and Harvard epidemiologist Mark Lipsich, talking about the modeling of COVID and the social implication of this modeling. So you're all invited to join us for this debate between Jonathan Fuller and Mark Lipsich on January 19th. It should be an exciting debate. On the 22nd and 23rd of January, the center is organizing a conference on ancestry. And on the 26th at noon, it will be the first lunchtime talk, which will be given by John Norton on how to make possibilities safe for empiricists. So that's the first steps for next year. If you're interested in any of these events, go to the center's website and go to the calendar and just register for the calendar. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce a center's friend, Roberto Fumagalli, who has already spoken to us in the past, and we're delighted to invite him again today. Roberto is a permanent lecturer in the Department of Political Economy. That's a new position, I think, right, at King's College London. He's also the director of the Philosophy, Politics and Economics program at King's, and he was actually before a lecturer at King's College London. So he's published extensively on the philosophy of economics, on also social and political philosophy in, as one says, the best journals. Studies and philosophy of science, synthesis, philosophical studies, biology and philosophy, and so on, and so on, and so forth. We are delighted to hear him, to listen to him today, because he's going to talk on, sadly, a timely topic, but of a socially important issue. We should not use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources. Roberto, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Edward, and a very welcome to you all. And thank you so much for the great invitation. I am truly delighted, actually, to share these thoughts together with you 4 years after, actually, my last in-person visit to the center, which I very much look forward to renew when the times will be better. So, during the ongoing, unfortunately, COVID-19 pandemics, dramatic increases in the demand for intensive care units have occurred across different countries. And these kind of increases have forced medical personnel across several countries to engage in thorny triage decisions. Now, most of the allocation criteria that have been proposed for allocating intensive care units or also similar kind of medical resources, think of organ replacement therapy, for instance, or forward-looking, perhaps some kind of vaccines. Most of the allocation criteria for these goods involve a combination of medical needs, a variety of clinical factors, such as the existence and the severity of existing medical conditions, and some sorts of randomization procedures, and henceforth RAND. Now, in the recent literature across philosophy, medicine, and public policy, a variety of arguments have been put forward to support the use of randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources. The idea is that when it's impossible to divide these scarce life-saving resources, or in situations where dividing these resources would actually hamper or undermine completely the benefits provided by these resources, we should actually use randomization procedures to allocate these particular resources. What I would like to do in these specific papers is to provide a systematic categorization and a critical evaluation of the most prominent arguments that have been put forward in support of the use of these randomization procedures. More specifically, I like to examine together with you the argument from convenience, the argument from tie breaking, the one from equal chances, the argument from fairness, the argument from incommensurability, and the argument from indirect discrimination. And my main claim, so the claim that I'll try to support in the course of this talk, is that none of these arguments, as they actually stand, justifies using randomization procedures for allocating scarce life-saving resources. And on top of that, the decision makers, namely, for instance, the medical personnel, individual doctors, ethical committees, or even governmental organizations, should actually allocate scarce life-saving resources directly to the individuals who have the strongest claims to these resources, rather than using randomization procedures to allocate these particular resources. So the main claim will be that we should actually use what I call direct allocation procedures, DARE, so forth, rather than randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources. Now, to be sure, my claim is not that in general, any kind of direct allocation procedures you could possibly think of is always superior to randomization procedures. I mean, in fact, we can actually think of a variety of quite terrible direct allocation procedures. Think of explicitly racist or homophobic kind of direct allocation procedures. Rather, my claim is more qualified, and it's that for any kind of allocation procedures involving kind of scarce life-saving resources, we can identify at least some direct allocation procedures which are superior to randomization procedures, which is to say, in this kind of perspective that I'm advocating, randomization procedures are at best some kind of second best solution, some suboptimal solution compared to the best available direct allocation procedures that we actually have available. Now, before diving into each of these 6 arguments taken one by one and then gently moving towards the end, let me provide you with some preliminary remarks about the contents of this paper. To begin with, some kind of terminology. So I will speak of scarce life-saving resources to encompass a wide range of treatments and or therapies that are actually critical to patient survival. So as I said before, you can think of intensive care units, some organ replacement therapy, or vaccine to make the thing salient. And in particular, I shall use the expression randomization procedures to allocate a number of allocation procedures that are actually designed to yield specific distributions of probabilities regarding the various involved individuals. And in particular, I will make the following distinction between unweighted randomization procedures and weighted randomization procedures. Now, unweighted allocation procedures and randomization procedures especially, they actually give all the involved individuals exactly the same chance of receiving the available scarce life-saving resource. Conversely, weighted randomization procedures proportion the chance that each individual has of receiving the scarce life-saving resources to the strength of the claim that this individual has to these particular resources. That's the only main kind of distinction I shall draw in the realm of different randomization procedures. Now, an additional preliminary remark I want to make is that occasionally randomization procedures and direct allocation procedures may actually support factually similar allocation across the involved individuals. But the point remains that even when randomization procedures and direct allocation procedures actually support similar allocation, those 2 different kinds of allocation procedures actually rest on rather different justificatory principles. And just to make this salient, I mean, the point is that on direct allocation procedures, the strength of the claims that each individual has to the available resources directly determines not just the chance that this individual has to receive this available resource, as it will happen in randomization procedures, but also exactly which people at the end of the day will get the scarce life-saving resources. Now, of course, which people actually will receive these resources may not be predictable ex ante by the involved policymakers or decision makers, but the point is that the role of the strength of the claim that each individual has to get the relevant resources plays a much more fundamental and much more prominent role in direct allocation procedure rather than in randomization procedures. And finally, there are many possible different grounds for ascribing claims to scarce life-saving resources. Now, the important point I want to make is that I am not in the business with this particular paper to provide you with the theory of claims, which is to say, I'm not in the business of trying to identify exactly which sort of reasons ground claims to scarce life-saving resources or what kind of factors determine the strength of the claims. For my purposes, the only important point to make is that, well, not any or not all reasons that you may possibly have to receive a scarce life-saving resources by themselves constitute strong claims to get these particular resources. So just to give you one example, the mere fact that you intensely want to receive some particular scarce life-saving resources does not per se constitute a claim to this particular resource. That's the only basic distinction I need for the purpose of my evaluation. Now, that said, I would say enough for a stage setting. So let's dive one by one on the 6 main arguments that have been put forward to support the use of randomization procedures. So the first argument that I would like to explore together with you is the argument from convenience. The main claim of this argument is that we should use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources on the alleged ground that designing and implementing randomization procedures is less costly and less time-consuming than it would actually be designing and implementing some direct allocation procedures. So the idea is that acquiring the information that will be required to establish exactly which candidates have the strongest claim to the available scarce life-saving resources is actually quite expensive and is also quite time-consuming. And randomization procedures enable the decision makers to actually avoid the cost and the time expenditure of deliberate selection, which is to say, based on convenience consideration, we should actually opt for randomization procedures rather than direct allocation procedures. Now, I have at least 2 main reasons for doubting that these kind of arguments from convenience actually justify using randomization procedures in this setting. So let me briefly expand on each of these 2 reasons in turn. And in the process of doing so, I shall try to preempt some additional objections that you may have on the way. And I will engage in this sorts of reflective exercise for each of the 6 arguments we'll explore together. So my first reason for doubting this sort of argument from convenience is that convenience consideration actually rarely justify using randomization procedures. And the point, I think, is simply that there is a huge variety of different randomization procedures. And establishing exactly which randomization procedures to adopt, just think of weighted versus unweighted randomization procedures, would actually require the relevant decision makers to determine the strengths and the differential strengths of different individuals' claims to the available scarce life-saving resources. And on top of that, try to determine how the differences in strengths between this claim actually bear on the justifiability of randomization procedures, which is to say, establishing which kind of randomization procedures to adopt will require the proponents of randomization procedures to engage in exactly the same kind of operations that they think is so costly on the shoulder of direct allocation procedures. And on top of this reason, I have an additional one, namely that, well, when we think about what sort of factors we should consider when determining how to allocate scarce life-saving resources, convenience consideration are only one of the factors that we should consider, but they are not the only factor that bears on the justifiability of different allocation procedures. And the fact is that even in situations of dire emergency, think of, for instance, I'm speaking from Italy at the moment, and northern Italy actually, which was an unfortunately relatively easy the epicenter of the pandemic. Even in the first peak of the pandemic here in Italy, doctors were able to actually assess at least a few factors on top of convenience consideration that actually bear on the justifiability of different allocation procedures. I mean, just to think of sheer and major differences in terms of medical need or likelihood of recovery across different patients, which is to say, convenience consideration are definitely a major factor, but they are not the only factor. And even in situation of dire emergencies, we can and should actually assess these sorts of evaluation and allocations on the basis of additional factors. Now, suppose that you are a proponent of this argument from convenience. You may try to put forward some additional objections to try to say, well, no matter what I am replying, I'm not still getting the point of this particular argument. So let me play together with you with a couple of additional objections here. The first objection in support of this argument from convenience is that, well, direct allocation procedures are simply not convenient because the difference in strengths between different individuals' claim to the available resources is actually just way too small compared with the costs that actually are required in order to get the required information to assess the strengths of different claims. However, I'm not convinced by this objection for the simple reasons that when it comes to the allocation and specifically the allocation of scarce life-saving resources, these sorts of allocation exercise have crucial life and death implications. and the axiological relevance of these life and death implications typically trump the cost of acquiring the information that is required to identify the strongest claims across the available individuals. Now, a proponent of these arguments from convenience may further object that these randomization procedures are still commendable and superior on the alleged ground that they actually relieve the doctors of the burden of responsibility of deciding who is to live and who is actually, unfortunately, to die, and of the associated emotional and psychological burden. But again, I would reply to this objection that when it comes to the allocation of scarce life-saving resources, these sorts of decisions still make all of the difference between life and death, and considerations of the putative psychological benefits that using randomization procedures rather than direct allocation procedures would allegedly yield to the involved decision makers rarely trump the axiological difference, the axiological relevance, of the difference between the strengths of all the individuals' claims that are involved. And on top of that, I would actually like to add as well that while randomization procedures and using randomization procedures does not actually exempt the doctors from the burden of responsibility to actually try to make the best decision they can possibly can. I mean, in this respect, I think that relying on randomization procedures at some kind of early screening stage of the allocation process would actually amount to abandoning and relinquishing one's responsibility as a doctor rather than actually exercising that sort of responsibility. So in a nutshell, I'm not convinced at all actually that appealing to convenience consideration justifies using randomization procedures. Let's move on with the second argument, the argument from tie-breaking. The argument from tie-breaking claims that we should use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources on the alleged ground that randomization procedures are good tiebreakers, namely they are effective means to get the decision makes whenever the claims of different candidates are exactly balanced. So the thought here is that when all the different individuals are involved, have equally strong claims to the available scarce life-saving resources, the involved decision makers should use randomization procedures rather than direct allocation procedures to actually allocate these particular goods. Again, I have at least two reasons for doubting that this argument from tie-breaking justifies using randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources. And as I did before, let me briefly unpack my two replies and then try to anticipate and preempt some potential objections you may have on the way. So my first reply is that decision makers, and this is a consideration that actually maybe are partly even against direct allocation procedures, decision makers are not always able to establish whether the claims of different individuals are actually equally strong or even roughly equal. And the point here is simply that the strengths of different claims depend on a multiplicity of factors. And it's actually frequently hard to assess the impact of different factors on the strength of the claims of the involved individuals. Just to give you an example, the mere fact that all the involved individuals in these thorny three-edged decisions all have an equal claim to life, or that their lives are equally worthy, falls short of implying that these individuals have equal claims to these specific life-saving resources that have been allocated. So just pointing to the alleged fact that all of us has exactly the same claim to life, so to speak, falls short of implying that in the specific allocation procedures we are considering, all the different individuals are equally positioned in terms of the strength of their claims to these particular resources. And on top of that, and that's my second reason, in all of those considerations where the relevant decision makers are able to establish the strengths of different claims, the claims of the involved individuals rarely have exactly equal strengths. I mean, just think of all the differences between the involved individuals in terms of medical needs, in terms of likelihood to benefits, in terms of a number of medical conditions they may actually have. And already this fact cast out on the potential of tie-breaking consideration to ground a wide range case in favor of randomization procedure, which is to say, if tie-breaking considerations only work when the claims are exactly equal, then even minor differences in the strength of the claim would imply that these tie-breaking considerations literally do not apply anymore. And therefore, the domain of application of this tie-breaking argument is quite limited, if it's viable at all. Now, a proponent of this argument for tie-breaking may object that, well, Roberto, go slowly here, because if one allocates scarce life-saving resources directly to some individuals rather than others, one is actually treating some lives as more worthy than others, and that's actually problematic. However, as I said before, I mean, one could point out here, and I think quite convincingly, that one may simultaneously claim and consistently claim that individuals' lives are equally worthy as lives, but that does not imply that the claims of this individual to the specific life-saving resources that have been allocated in concrete situations are also equal. So there needs to be something more on top of appealing to generally and putatively equal rights to life in order to license the additional claim that the strengths of the claims of these individuals that are involved in the allocation of specific life-saving resources are also equal. Again, a proponent of this argument may further object that decision makers in a number of situations may actually be able to narrow down the sets of available candidates so much that they are, in the end of the day, practically indifferent between which of these individuals to save. And my reply in this respect is that whenever decision makers can actually identify some differences in strength between the available individuals, carefully defined and designed direct allocation procedures are much more likely than randomization procedures to actually allocate scarce life-saving resources to individuals who have strong claim to these resources rather than to individuals who have weaker claim to these resources, which is to say, direct allocation procedures, at least the best available ones, rather than them generally, are still superior to randomization procedures, even when taking in consideration these tie-breaking considerations. Now, this concludes in a nutshell the evaluation of the second argument. Now, let me move on and consider together the argument from equal chances. The argument from equal chances holds that we should use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources on the alleged ground that when individuals have equal claims to these resources, justice demands that each person receives equal chance. So the thought here, quite differently than the previous two arguments, is that randomization procedures actually have a unique capacity to divide goods probabilistically. And in particular, they allegedly enable the decision makers to substitute equality of outcomes with equality of chances, which is a surrogate form of satisfaction, but arguably is the best thing we can do for the potential patients in the thorny, tragic situations we are facing when it comes to allocating scarce life-saving resources. As I did before, let me go over some kind of replies that I have to this argument and try to unarm some particular objections you may have about this. My first reply to this sort of argument builds on what I said in reply to the previous arguments as well, is that individuals' claim rarely have exactly equal strengths, which is in turn already cast out on the potential of this argument to ground a wide-ranging case for randomization procedures. But more informatively, and let me expand here on the second reply I have to this argument. I think it's quite hard to see in what sense exactly chances of satisfaction would constitute surrogate satisfaction in such a way that giving equal chances to different individuals would actually be a way to treat people fairly. To put it differently, I think that the chances given by randomizations to the various individuals do not actually benefit any of these individuals in a way that makes it prudentially better for this individual that randomization is used rather than some forms of direct allocation procedures. So there seems to be a category mistake here, I think, involved in considering chances as the same sort of good as the goods we are after when we are trying to allocate life-saving resources across the involved individuals. Now, in this respect, a proponent of this argument from equal chances may actually object that, well, these differences in strengths between the strengths of the different claims of the involved individuals are actually of minor relevance, so they could argue, compared to the importance of giving each person an equal chance. So the idea will be here to acknowledge that there may be some differences in strength between the claims of different individuals, but still the importance of giving equal chance to each and all the individuals involved trumps the relevance and the axiological relevance of these particular differences. I have a threefold reply to these sorts of objection. First, I think that the allocation of scarce life-saving resources have once again life and death implications, whose axiological relevance typically trump the importance of giving equal chances to different individuals. I mean, at the very least, the proponents of the arguments of equal chances here owe us some kind of explanation as to why giving equal chance to all the involved individuals will be so important as to trump the axiological relevance of the differences between the claims and the strengths of the claim of different individuals to the available resources. Secondly, and coming back to the interpretation of the value of chances in this context, I think that the chances given by randomization procedures are not some sort of additional goods to be added to the expected utility of being saved. Actually, I think, as Henning aptly points out, it would actually amount to some sort of double counting to consider chances as additional goods on top of the expected utility of being saved, because this expected utility already incorporates some evaluation of the chances. And finally, it is not generally the case that the chance of benefits is itself a benefit. Now, here I want to say that some particular individuals might actually want to ascribe intrinsic relevance and intrinsic value to chances. But the point is that it's not generally the case that this is the case. And as Wasserman, I think, memorably put it, we are not in the business of eating chances after all. So at the end of the day, what saves the lives of the involved individuals are the scarce resources that we are after. And there is a limited room for the proponents of the argument from equal chances to actually show that chances are so valuable and that ascribing equal choices to the involved individuals is so valuable to trump the relevance of the other axiologically relevant factors that are also involved. And on top of all the factors, just consider the strength of these different individuals' claim to these resources. I mean, let me stop just for a second here. Before moving on the set of the other final arguments that I would like to consider together with you. And Edward, just stop me in case I happen to go over time, but I think I managed to finish in the 45 minutes. So the argument from fairness holds that we should actually use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources, on the alleged ground that these randomization procedures are actually fairer than direct allocation procedures. And they are at times the fairest thing we could possibly do when it comes to distributing and allocating scarce life-saving resources. The thought here is that fairness, and I'm really building and targeting here John Broom's famous arguments from fairness, requires that each claim by the various individuals be satisfied in proportion to its strength. So the idea in a nutshell is that when the strengths of different individuals' claim to this good are actually equal, we should use an unweighted randomization procedures. When the strength actually differs, we should use a weighted randomization procedures with the weights proportional to the strength of the claim of each individual as to the available scarce life-saving resources. Now, as before, I have at least two reasons to doubt that this kind of argument justifies using randomization procedures in this context. First and foremost, I think that fairness is important, but is not, again, the only factor that we ought to consider. And in particular, for all the argument shows, fairness considerations may actually fail to actually trump all the other factors that are involved. And I'm here thinking, when I speak of the other factors, of the social good that may be promoted by engaging in direct allocation procedures with clear criteria rather than randomization procedures. Or also I'm thinking of the difference in medical need and in the likelihood to benefits across the different involved individuals. And secondly, and more poignantly, this kind of arguments from fairness, I think, does not show that randomization procedures are actually even fairer than direct allocation procedures. Because the point is that the involved individuals rarely have equally strong claims to the available scarce life-saving resources, as we have seen. And when the strengths of different individuals' claim to these resources greatly differ from each other, it would actually be positively unfair to allocate these scarce life-saving resources using randomization procedures. I mean, if the difference between the strengths of the claim between different individuals is so strong, why should we even rely on randomization procedures in the first place? Now, a proponent of this argument from fairness may actually object to what I just said and say, well, Roberto, wait a second, you're not really getting the subtle points that Broom's argument is trying to make here. And the point is that decision makers can actually track the strengths of different claims by means of weighted randomization procedures. I mean, one could claim this is exactly the point that Broom was trying to make. But I'm not persuaded by this move. And the reason is simply the following. I mean, I'll try to make it with a simple example here. Suppose that there is just two individuals involved, you on the one end and me, and we are competing for one scarce intensive care unit. Now, suppose for the sake of argument that your claims are actually much weightier, much stronger than the ones I do have. Is really there any unfairness in you directly getting the good rather than me getting it? Or even in you getting the good rather than you getting the good on top or as a result of a lottery? Now, some proponents of this kind of argument from fairness may hold that, well, in spite of this additional kind of reply, this kind of Broomian argument still justifies using randomization procedures unless the claims of different individuals are actually strongly unequal. So the thought, as Christian Piller puts it, is that the argument will still justify using randomization procedures in all those situations where the claims are actually roughly equal. And I have two kind of further replies to these further objections, so to speak. One, I think, is that, well, I mean, like if rough equality is what is actually required to make this argument flying, I think that this limits the potential to the argument to ground wide-ranging cases in favor of randomization procedures. But on top of that, I think that this appeal to rough equality does not actually provide us with some sort of precise or informative criteria to establish when exactly the difference in strength between the different claims of the involved individuals is small enough that the putative fairness gains yielded by the use of randomization procedures actually trump the unfairness which blatantly occurs in all those cases where the weaker claims happen to win and happen to get the scarce life-saving resources, leaving the people with stronger claim to these resources without any good and left to die. Getting towards the final part of my exposition. Argument from incommensurability. The argument from incommensurability holds that we should use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources on the alleged ground that it often seems impossible to weight and compare different individuals' claims in any precise way. So the thought here is that, well, whenever the strengths of different individual claims simply is incommensurable, the decision maker should actually allocate scarce life-saving resources on the basis of randomization procedures rather than direct allocation procedures. Because whenever the strength of this claim is incommensurable, there will simply be no way for the involved decision makers to make a principle justify the direct allocation. And therefore, so the argument goes, they should actually resort to randomization procedures. I actually have three replies in this case, three reasons to doubt that this appeal to incommensurability consideration justifies using randomization procedures. First, I think that showing that the strength of different claims is actually incommensurable requires the proponent of these arguments from incommensurability to actually show that the relevant comparisons are impossible, not just costly, difficult, inconvenient, or you name what. And the problem, I think, is that the proponents of these arguments from incommensurability, so far at least, have not shown that these cases of incommensurability are so widespread as it's required to license a wide-ranging call in favor of randomization procedures. Secondly, the difficulties that are actually inherent in assessing the strength of different individuals' claim to the available scarce life-saving resources do not actually prevent informed judgments of strength of these individuals' claims. I mean, for instance, think of ordinal judgments of different individuals' claim. Think of the difficulty of judging different individuals' medical needs. There are obviously a number of difficult issues to solve when it comes to judging and evaluating different individuals' medical needs. So any sorts of cardinal measurement seems off the way. But that does not exclude in any way the ability of the relevant doctors or the medical or the ethical committees, let's say, to provide informative ordinal judgments of these different individuals' medical needs. Third, I think that deciding exactly which sort of randomization procedures to use, just think of the decision between weighted versus unweighted randomization procedures, would actually require the proponents of these procedures to assess the strengths of different individuals' claims and to assess how strongly they differ in terms of strength, which is to say, while pointing to these difficulties or these alleged incommensurability that are involved in assessing the strengths of different individuals' claim, does not per se license regarding randomization procedure as more justified than direct allocation procedures, In fact, it could even backfire against the proponent of randomization procedures, because randomization procedures face exactly the same incommensurabilities faced by the proponents of direct allocation procedures. A proponent of this argument from incommensurability may further object that despite all I said so far, whenever an agent is unsure regarding what the morally right thing to do, namely what the morally right allocation is in any given context, then using randomization procedure is actually the best that we can do, given our own moral uncertainty. And my friend and colleague Tiny-san has an interesting kind of take on this potential objection. And I have a twofold reply to this objection. First, I think, as Itai himself acknowledges, this kind of objection only supports randomization procedures only when it is epistemically impossible to identify the morally right allocation for decision makers. And this already greatly limits the potential to ground a wide-ranging case for lotteries or for randomization procedures better in concrete situations. And the point is that in many cases, the relevant decision makers can actually resolve or at least alleviate the moral uncertainty that is involved by acquiring more information about the actually thorny, tragic situation and decision-making problems that they are actually facing. And when I speak of acquiring more information about this problem, I mean acquiring information about issues such as what kind of randomization or direct allocation procedures are feasible, what kind of consequences the available allocations have for the available individuals, what kind of values different normative theories assign to alternative and competing allocations, which is to say there is something to say in favor of this appeal to moral uncertainty consideration. But if the argument flies only when it's epistemically impossible, and it is demonstrably the case that it's epistemically impossible for the involved agents to identify the morally right allocation, I think that the potential scope of this argument is quite limited indeed. Last but not least, let's cover also this final argument, and then I'll pause after this argumentative bombardment, so to speak. The last argument I'd like to explore together with you is the argument from indirect discrimination. And this argument holds that we should actually use randomization procedures to allocate scarce life-saving resources, because direct allocation procedures are often indirectly discriminatory. So the idea here is that whereas randomization procedures can actually ensure that bad decisions are kept out of the decision and that we can exclude any sorts of unjust influences, direct allocation procedures are unfortunately vulnerable to all sorts of problematic and immoral biases. And therefore, in the name of screening of these biases, we should actually opt for randomization procedures. So the thought here, to put it differently, is that randomization procedures are less vulnerable than direct allocation procedures to all sorts of discriminatory biases that have been shown again and again to play a role in these thorny allocation procedures. Just to give you an example to make it salient again, think of all the different ways in which direct allocation procedures will tend to adversely affect disabled or otherwise disadvantaged individuals because of factors that are actually unrelated to their medical condition. Think, for instance, of socioeconomic status, or the kind of job in which these people have been actually employed, and the related risk during the COVID pandemic. I have two reasons to doubt that this appeal to this discriminatory and anti-discriminatory consideration justifies any kind of role and use for randomization procedures. First of all, might seem a cheap point, but perhaps worth repeating in this context. Not all of the factors that happen to make a difference to allocation are actually unjustifiably discriminatory. And to make this point more salient, I mean, consider what's going on in the current COVID pandemic. Suppose that the involved medical personnel were to actually allocate the scarce intensive care units directly in terms of age and no other factor whatsoever. This would actually arguably discriminatory against the old people and against the elderly. However, suppose that the doctors, as they occasionally do, were to ground allocation on the capacity to benefit, the likelihood to benefit of these individuals. If they were to rely on these sorts of allocation criteria, this will predictably, it will foreseeably disadvantage the elderly. So it will make a difference in a way that actually clearly disadvantages the elderly, but it will do so only as a byproduct, only indirectly. So the mere fact that adopting this kind of criteria will make a clear difference and a statistically significant difference to allocation disadvantaging the elderly does not per se make these sorts of allocation unjustifiably discriminatory against the elderly. Second reply to this sorts of argument. The mere fact that discriminatory biases may bias some direct allocation procedures and can definitely do so. So that's clearly a problem that we need to take into account and try to counter, does not cast general doubt on the justifiability of direct allocation procedures. Because these kind of discriminatory biases do not generally undermine or hamper the reliability of direct allocation procedures. And in fact, direct allocation procedures can alleviate biases. And there are a number of strategies available already in the current literature and in the current medical practice. Think, for instance, of all the blinding mechanisms against the temptation to ground allocation procedures based on patients' ability to pay, ethnicity, sexual orientation consideration, and other kind of factors that we think should be left out of these allocation procedures. Very final objections I'll consider and then I'll conclude. A proponent of this argument from indirect discrimination may further object that despite all I said, these randomization procedures are actually more effective than direct allocation procedures in preventing decision makers from engaging in some sorts of arbitrary exercise of power, or even in preventing the candidates themselves in trying to make themselves more eligible to sunk cost themselves or to society at large. I have 3 replies to this final objection before the end. First, randomization procedures are not always less vulnerable to bias than direct allocation procedures. In fact, some kind of discriminatory biases, think of racist biases, can demonstrably influence both the calibration of the weights in weighted lotteries and the judgments as to whether the conditions for using and justifiably using randomization procedures even hold in the first place. Secondly, when it comes to policy making and policy design of the choice architecture, the outcome uncertainty associated with randomization procedures, together with the indirect relevance that the strengths of different individuals' claims have according to randomization procedures for the allocation of scarce life-saving resources, can actually remove valuable incentives to try to encourage, to promote valuable, desirable behavior on the individual's part. Think of other regarding behavior, think of prudent behavior, namely the kind of behavior we would like to encourage and promote at the policy level during this current COVID pandemics. Conversely, and that's an additional reasons I think in favor of direct allocation procedures, direct allocation procedures can actually be calibrated in such a way that they directly incentivize precisely these sorts of other regarding or prudent behavior in ways that is not available to actually the proponents of randomization procedures. So in a nutshell, not only direct allocation procedures do not seem more vulnerable than randomization procedures to these obnoxious discriminatory bias that we all want to fight and we all want to counter, but they seem to have additional kind of room for maneuvering in trying to contrast these sorts of discriminatory biases. To conclude, and to stay exactly in the time I was so graciously given, in this paper, I examined what I regard the most influential arguments that have been put forward to support the use of randomization procedures in allocating scarce life-saving resources. And I've then argued that none of these arguments as they currently stand justifies using randomization procedures rather than direct allocation procedures in allocating these resources. Now, this result does not per se exclude that some kind of additional arguments might be put forward who actually support specific randomization procedures when allocating some particular life-saving resources. But I take it, these sorts of cumulative argument by exclusion, to make it pressing for the proponents of randomization procedures to articulate and actually support those putative to be specified arguments. And in the absence of these arguments, I think that the relevant decision makers should actually allocate scarce life-saving resources directly to the individuals with the strongest claim to these resources, rather than using randomization procedures to allocate these resources. Which is to say, we should put our mind and heart in front and above randomization procedures. Thank you so much for the attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this fascinating talk. So let me just remind you how we're proceeding here. Since we're using Zoom webinar, you must click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write your name. Once you've written your name, I will promote you to the panelist status, and you will be able to ask your question directly to Roberto. And I will do that right now for the first of you. All right. John, the floor is yours.
Hello, hello. Thanks so much.
Hello.
I enjoyed that. Hold on, let me just restart my video. There we go. Hi, okay, great. So I had one question that's half comment, half question, and then one was really just a second, more minor point regarding the tie-breaking idea. So the first is that when you were talking about the final justification for randomization, this avoiding discriminatory biases, I mean, it really, for me, brought to mind the chief justification often given for why we use randomization in clinical research from an epistemic point of view, which is often said to reduce epistemic biases that could thwart our epistemic inferences. And you know, this idea could be traced right back to the 1950s. And when Bradford Hill, who quite vocally made this argument, was describing it, I mean, one of the things he said was that, you know, in order to place credibility in these randomized clinical trials, other studies that use randomization, which were foreign to the medical community, we had to give them a reason for thinking that it was more credible. And you know, one argument for this would be that randomization would reduce subjective biases that might otherwise foil the results. So it wasn't just that randomization would make the results more trustworthy, but also was that it would add a sheen of credibility to the results and therefore would allow people to accept and trust the results. So I'm just wondering, you know, in today's climate, when there is a lot of distrust of medicine and scientific research in general, whether that might be a related reason to think that randomization might be important with respect to discriminatory biases. So even if it in fact doesn't always, even if it isn't always the best way to mitigate these biases, it might be the way that adds the most credibility to those results and therefore increases trust and uptake in that process. So that's just one thought. And the second thing I think is quite a bit more minor is that with respect to this tiebreak argument, I mean, one thing you said as an objection was that it's unlikely that people's moral claims will be exactly balanced, and therefore it's very unlikely that we'll need to use this tie-breaking procedure. But it seems to me that what's ultimately important here is not whether or not the moral claims are in fact perfectly balanced, but whether or not an imperfect decision maker is able to discriminate between the moral claims of one individual and another. And you might think that given how imperfect people are as moral agents, you know, we might be in the situation of having some relative uncertainty about whose claims are the strongest, even if, as a matter of fact, most of the time people's moral claims will be imbalanced.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Great questions. Let me start with the first one that you actually posed. So I definitely agree that there are issues of trustworthiness and of credibility as well. And I think, especially from a policymaking perspective, we ought to take these issues of credibility really seriously, especially as you see, I think, aptly noted in the current climate. Just a couple of remarks there. So to begin with, I think that if these doubts about credibility, about the way in which the whole procedure is actually designed, implemented, are so serious, I think that, so if we work at this non-ideal level of reflection, we should adopt the very same non-ideal level of reflection when evaluating randomization procedures, which is to say, if we do not trust the relevant decision maker to make a honest, really careful, well-balanced, direct allocation procedures, I think that, well, the same kind of doubts seem to apply, at least prima facie, to some kind of decision makers designing and implementing a randomization procedures for the following reason. Even the choice of what kind of randomization procedures to adopt out of all the many randomization procedures available. I mean, just think of the decision weighted versus unweighted. If we go weighted, how to actually determine the weight. If these kind of issues of credibility are so salient, which by the way, I think they actually are, well, I don't see this as playing necessarily selectively against direct allocation procedures as opposed to both randomization and direct allocation procedures. And as an ancillary point about this issue, which I do take seriously, I think that there is a parallel debate, which I think ought to be disentangled from the kind of debate I had between direct versus randomized procedures, namely how to make sure that the debate about what procedure to adopt is public and transparent. So I think this is a crucial, important point, and I think it's really the main target of the point you were raising, the first one at least, namely that we need to find ways of conducting this public and transparent debate, but I take that the conditions that are enabling that sort of debate is a bit of a tangential issue with regard to exactly what kind of methods we should use at the later stage to allocate concretely this particular good. So definitely credibility is crucial. It's just to say that it does not selectively veer in favor of randomization procedures versus direct allocation procedures. And regarding the other issue about tie breaking, I mean, point taken. To translate it and paraphrase it, I shouldn't be making too much maybe of the fact that claims are rarely exactly equal, so to speak, because the crucial issue is that for all we know, they seem to be exactly equal and we cannot discriminate between them. I agree with it. I take it though that especially in the later part of my presentation with the argument from incommensurability, I'm addressing the later concerns that you actually voiced, namely with regard to moral uncertainty and the fact that we are not able to commensurate different individuals' claim. I think that they do address the kind of variant of the tie-breaking argument you were actually voicing before. I mean, one additional thing I could do is maybe to do some further work by distinguishing between incommensurability and incomparability in some particular setting and try to address that particular variant. But I think that generally, I think you can see and anticipate the thrust of the kind of consideration I'll put forward.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thanks, John. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the talk. It's a very interesting topic, and I just wanted to maybe revisit a little bit the very last argument that you considered, which was, you know, in the economics language, the incentive compatibility argument. That was the concern that randomization might be the only way to incentivize people to reveal private information that might be relevant to the allocation decision. And I guess I wasn't quite sure what the argument was there. And I thought maybe to frame things a little bit, I'd just say, you know, there's this famous result, mathematical result due to Alan Gibbard in the 70s or 80s or something like that, that says that, you know, the only voting system which is totally immune to strategic manipulation is one that involves randomization. So you said, well, randomization isn't always better than deterministic. And I mean, that's true. Like, obviously, you can construct a decision situation where randomization would not be necessary. But I guess it strikes me that there's pretty strong evidence in certain situations that randomization is the only way to achieve incentive compatibility. And so I just wanted to get a clearer sense of what that first bullet point, what the quantifiers and organization of that first bullet point was in light of results like that.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Let me make a couple of points, I think, regarding this very specific issue of incentive compatibility. I mean, like, one important caveat I should add is that I'm specifically targeting the allocation of scarce life-saving resources. It's not part of my case that whatever argument in favor of incentive compatibility I'm making extends to other sorts of allocation procedure, not to mention voting procedure. So really, I mean, whatever I say that with regard to the allocation of scarce life-saving resources is compatible with me taking a rather different stance when we are changing actually the argument and the topic in that respect. So I'm not committed, so to speak, to the generalizability of the points I was specifically making about allocation procedures, basically in this respect. One additional consideration, which perhaps is not so directly tied to what you aptly say there, but invites us perhaps to consider perhaps some unintended effects of using randomization procedures, not just on the behavior of the subjects we are targeting, namely the individuals who are involved, but even on the decision makers themselves. It actually worries me that if we allow decision makers to use randomization procedures, we might risk incentivize them not to think carefully enough not to make the full use of the evidence that we do have available, however costly might be to obtain it, and to rely and to resort to lotteries way too early in a decision-making process. So one of the objections I sometimes had when it comes to this sort of presentation, and I had a very similar objection by Peter Stone, for instance, who famously made a case in favor of lotteries. He says, look, I mean, he says, we never say that lotteries are the first thing we should use. Rather, we use them when we run out of additional reasons, so to speak. And in a sense, I see the point, but I also fear that if we allow this use of randomization procedures across the board, it's really an obnoxious incentive for the decision makers not to make full use of the evidence they have available and to actually disregard the reasons that do make a difference to the strength of the claims of the involved individuals. Would you have a follow-up on some of them, Kevin?
Yeah. If it's okay, Edward, if you don't mind. In particular, on that last point, do you have an example in mind of a setting where randomization, where the optimal randomization procedure, or not? I mean, obviously, we could construct a sort of cockamamie randomization procedure, but one where you think that an randomization procedure that people allocate would actually disincentivize people? I mean, I guess that's the thing, is because usually when people recommend randomization, it's precisely because of its incentive compatibility. And so then to say, well, but it might be incentive incompatible, I don't know, it just sort of feels like you're sort of, I mean, I don't know, but sorry, I'm not putting my thoughts together clearly. Of course, we can construct randomization procedures that are incentive incompatible, but I don't think anyone would find that surprising. So then the question is, you know, do you have a setting in mind where you think that randomization would be incentive incompatible, or that it would always be incentive incompatible, or something like that?
Okay, no, I mean, like, then one has to be careful. I mean, about, I mean, the claim I'm making is not that direct allocation procedures are always more incentive compatible than randomization procedures. The point I'm making is that the best available direct allocation procedures are performing better than randomization procedures. So, because otherwise, I mean, the point you're making, I mean, one could run it the other way around as well, of course, against direct allocation procedures. I mean, one comes up with the, you know, utterly discriminatory, for instance, to stay on the argument, allocation procedures, and then, I mean, it would seem that one is in trouble, but that's clearly not the case, I would say. Now, the point I was making there is really like that, when it comes to the non-ideal situations, because I mean, it seems to me that that kind of objection comes from a non-ideal perspective. So when it comes to the non-ideal circumstances where we actually meant to apply these sorts of randomization procedures, well, already knowing that that kind of option is available, it just disincentivizes the relevant decision maker from exerting all the kind of resources that they have in order to find who are the candidates who have the strongest claim to the available resources. So that's the kind of incentive incompatibility effect I was pointing at. But again, I'm not claiming that, you know, like in general, so I don't have any generality results, so to speak, or even an average result saying that on average, direct allocation performs better than randomization procedures in that respect. So it's really a qualified claim that specifically target the relevance and the scope of this appeal to unjust discrimination.
Thanks.
Kelly.
Hi, thanks, Roberto. So this is really dovetailing on a couple of other points that people have raised already, mostly on Jonathan's point. So I'm just wondering about how you're weighing your emphasis on justification with other kinds of pragmatic factors like political workability. I'm not really sure what to call it, but that seems to be sort of it for now. So Jonathan mentioned trustworthiness and credibility as salient factors here. And your response, well, what am I trying to say? So I think there's another factor, which is something like reaching a politically satisfactory result. So in your response, you were pointing out the importance of having these public and transparent debates about, you know, how the values that are informing the determinations of the strength of claims are made, which seems right. But also from a social epistemological perspective, like people's folk philosophies matter a lot here. So, and people often have very strong ideas about the fairness and the trustworthiness and the unbiasedness of mathematical procedures for decision-making. So, you know, one might think that even if policymakers are doing their due diligence to gather all of the relevant information, and they're doing their due diligence to try to unbias their direct allocation procedures in the way that you're suggesting, that still might not seem to be as strong of a justification for other people involved as, you know, the decision maker might think. And so there's another good that's at stake, which is something like reaching a politically workable solution. And it seems reasonable to think that for lots of people that would look more like a randomization procedure than a direct allocation procedure. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to balance that with your emphasis on the justifiability of the allocation procedure.
Great, and thank you so much, Kelly. And it's a bit surprising, you know, in one respect, because, you know, given the audience from philosophy of science, I was expecting more like some of the remarks I got previously by Jonathan and Kevin. This is a very interesting corrective, so to speak, for an overly philosophy of science centered approach that I might be taking as a philosopher of science to this question. But let me go back and focus actually on this issue of political workability, so to speak. I think that one way, and correct me if I'm paraphrasing in a way that is not faithful to your thought, is that, well, let's put ourselves from the perspective of the victim, so to speak, of the candidates who happen not to get these particular goods. What would they say from a political perspective? Would they accept more easily, so to speak, the outcome or the unfavorable outcome if it was generated by a randomization procedure as opposed to a direct allocation procedures? And in that respect, actually, I'm not so sure that people will be more at ease with an unfavorable outcome if it was the result of a randomization procedures rather than a direct allocation procedures. And a lot depends on the details, of course, but a couple of thoughts that I think may help in that kind of direction. Well, first, many of the objections that I receive when presenting this paper come with a kind of an unstated presupposition that there is this kind of choice between a panoply of direct allocation procedures, which are incredibly thorny and arbitrary to choose from. And then there is one clear alternative, we just use randomization and that's it, and all these kind of problems will be solved. But I think, and I try to make this point clearly during the talk, but the choice is really not like that, because it's not as simple, because even the choice of a randomization procedures actually open up a can of worms between most, if not all, the kind of issues that one faces, exactly the same difficulties that are faced when it comes to direct allocation procedures. So all these kinds of consideration, not just of convenience, but even of fairness, if one wants to mention a politically salient kind of value, do apply to randomization procedure and the choice of what exactly randomization procedure is adopted. So putting ourselves from the perspective of a potential victim, so to speak, or the unlucky patients, let's call them, it will not necessarily make it easier, I think, for them if the unfavorable result was the results of a particular randomization procedure, because it would obviously still open to them the question, well, why did they choose these randomization procedures rather than many other randomization procedures? And secondly, coming closely, I think, to the contrast between direct versus randomization procedures, well, did the relevant decision makers really do their job to the end, namely try to identify all the relevant differences between the strengths of the different individuals' claim, or they were, so to speak, a bit lazy and they relied on randomization procedures, even in presence of major differences? Because if we think of cases where there are clear differences, let's say medical need, likelihood to benefits, and so on, honestly, if I were a patient, if I have to be rejected, I rather prefer to be rejected because of a principled decision that is, of course, as I said before, public, transparent, and announced in advance, of course, not just because I happen to be against a very rich guy, of course. But I would rather prefer that rather than people coming there and tell me, well, you know, Roberto, we just, you know, ran a dice, we were unlucky, because I would say at that point, but gee, you know, have you considered the factors that I think you ought to consider in cases like that?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I don't know if this is relevant for the kind of argument that you're making. It just seems relevant from the perspective of being on the receiving end of some kind of judgment like this, that people oftentimes tend to accept a decision that seems to be made on not on the basis of some, you know, particular criteria over another, but where the decision is made by an agent that's less easy to pin down. I'm thinking of, like, you can't blame chance in the way that you can blame an individual, right? Like, being able to point to a particular person or a committee of people and say, they're the ones who determined that I should die, as opposed to saying, like, well, I mean, this is just how the dice rolled. there might be some, that might be relevant to, when it comes to reaching some politically workable solution, but, it might be tangential to the argument that you're making here.
Well, thanks for that as well, Kelly. I mean, I fully agree with you. We cannot blame chance, but we can and we should, I think, blame people for relying and resorting to chance ways too early in decisions of this sort. So I think we both agree on that point. And relatedly, I mean, I think your kind of remarks, and I think together with what Kevin was saying shortly before, I think they point to maybe the invitation more or less between the line, perhaps to think more carefully as to what is the maximum of this exercise. Is just sheer justifiability from a normative perspective, or there are also considerations, let's say, of moral psychology to take into account. For instance, suppose that I do identify from a philosophy of science perspective what neatly seems to be the most justifiable procedure, but people just don't get it, or people feel offended by it, or people just think that it's discriminatory in ways that they're mistaken, but I cannot show that to them. Should that alter actually the kind of justification, the allocation procedures I'm using? And in this respect, I would have to actually say candidly that I would have further thoughts to do in that respect. So the kind of business I am with this paper, and it might be preliminary kind of business with respect to an more ambitious project, is to identify what's the most justified procedure. Whether that license the claim that therefore, in all sorts of consideration, that's the one to adopt irrespective of what kind of reaction arises in people, I'm not so sure I would be ready to stand behind this kind of comment at this particular stage, at least.
Thanks, Kelly. Greg, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, and I very much agree with your central approach that the human decisions are really central to even in difficult circumstances. However, I am intrigued by the very close cases, and we do want to take scarce resource allocation cases as extreme, but at the same time, we don't want to sort of say we can't think about them. And in cases where things can be very close in a purely sort of medical, statistical, mathematical sense, one wonders whether a certain amount of randomization doesn't involve a certain amount of, bring in a certain amount of fairness insofar as it prevents things from becoming prevents a self-fulfilling prophecies. Here would be my case. One could imagine a rare kidney drug that is shown and you don't have enough to give to everyone, but across a decent spectrum of studies, it shows that 51% of people with type O blood will recover and survive 5 years down the line, but only 48% of people with type A blood would do so. Now, the question becomes how large are those samples? And to a certain extent, those are almost statistically insignificant. But if you use that as a criterion for allocating this scarce kidney drug, the O's then become even more favored. So you start slowly going from 51% survive to 54% to 57%, and the A's go down. So you create it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in a situation like that, one wonders whether or not a certain amount of randomization might not be ethically warranted, a weighted randomization in a case like that.
Thank you, Greg. And I think I could answer in multiple ways here. One clarification I should provide is the following. My claim is not that there is no possible case that one could consider and construct where randomization is more justified than DIR, all things considered. But my case will be, well, here it depends on a lot on how much one construct into these kinds of examples, okay? And my claim will be that cases of the sort that you have mentioned will be quite rare. Namely, what I think is going to be quite rare is that the claims are so close to each other and they are reliably, stably so, that using direct allocation rather than randomization procedure will present all the challenges and the slippery slope risk that you actually have mentioned. So I'm not in the business of saying that there is no possible case whatsoever that one can construct and one can think of where randomization are on a par or even superior to direct allocation procedures. But what I would challenge you there to specify exactly is, first, how likely you think that these particular cases will be in a real life situations. And secondly, even in those ideal cases, what exactly are the values that you think make randomization procedures reliably superior to the direct allocation procedures?
My case would be that a 3% differential in something like that is arguably not the ought to be the determinative factor, insofar as, for example, we know that different human populations have different blood types, statistically speaking.
Yeah.
And so therefore that artifact may be a distinction between where the studies were conducted in certain fashions or something to that effect. So and I agree that these rare cases, we don't want to turn them into absolutes, but at the same time, in the extremely close cases, one wonders whether or not the prior information that a medical provider might have is really sufficiently grounded to use as a final determinative factor. We can all come up with the classic random examples, the 46-year-old identical twins who to this day still look exactly, they have exactly identical body mass. And for some reason, someone always throws in the fact that one of them is right-handed dominant and the other's left-handed dominant, just for kicks. But nonetheless, there are cases that are close enough. There's a clarity in their distinction, but they're so close that prior information might not really be the best moral determinative.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg. And I think I do grant here that in cases where there are minor differences and we are also uncertainty about the reliability of the data, there might be further questions of the morality of risk-taking when it comes to life and death decision of that sort. So this I'm willing to grant, and I think it might be a convenient convergence point for us, at least at this stage of the conversation.
All right, thanks, Greg. If some of you have further questions, please write your name. We still have a little bit of time in the Q&A box. I'll give you a few seconds and I'll ask you a question. I mean, it's more of, in fact, a request for more information. Now, it's been really important that, actually, I would say at many parts of your arguments, to argue that both RAND and DEAR, so the two ways of assigning people, are on an equal footing, right? Both need the same information, So we are, and as you said in the Q&A, your opponent often seems to suggest that we know what the randomized procedures look like, but that's actually a mistake. We'll have to decide between them, and that creates some equal footing. So there's been a move that you've made a few times in your talk and also during the Q&A. Now, I think that's a really important point, and I'm really glad you've made it. On the other hand, I feel to be really quite compelling here, details are going to matter. And by details, I mean, well, what information, for example, does one exactly need to decide between randomization procedures? And it's only when you tell me that information that I'd be really convinced that RAND and DEAR are on the same footing. So that's a place where I feel I'm not quite in a position to assess your response if I'm not given more information about, okay, here's the info that's needed. And the reason I'm saying that is because I was considering another consideration that you did not mention that one might take to support DEAR over RAND, which is the role of error or mistakes or uncertainty about the information, right? You ask people to self-report their age, their gender, their nationality, their ethnicity, and so on and so forth, various types of demographics, their socioeconomic status, their job in society. People might not be honest, people might make mistakes. So there's a fair amount of error in actually the information that people provide. And we know that's bound to happen. And one might think that taking into account this information creates tons of issues because of the issues of possible fairness, issues of, so that might play somehow in some of the argument. Of course, you're going to reply that the same type of error are going to pop up for choosing between the various randomization procedures. But then I will want to know, well, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. Just tell me exactly what information is going to be used. And I'll tell you whether it's true that the same information, the same type of errors are going to pop up for choosing between randomization procedures, as might pop up for, in the case of direct procedures. So here I think details matter, and I worry that it's hard to give a very general argument at this level of abstraction.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward. And by the way, I'm learning every time strategically, because I like the fact that you politely wait for the end and you see all the kind of moves I'm making, and then you find the spots where I might be vulnerable. So that's very clever as well. Couple of quick replies on the various points, Edward. So that's a fair kind of concern that you may have there. And definitely, I mean, like one potential extension of this project will be case studies, and see what exactly is concretely done in medical practice. And not just that, speaking of scarce life-saving resources, but even the kind of scarce life-saving resources may matter. So for instance, the relative kind of merit, so to speak, of DIR versus RAND, to use the acronym, may depend whether we are talking of intensive care units versus vaccine, because the kind of factors that are likely to be relevant may vary, depend on particular effects of these treatments across the population, their variability, additional kind of social demographics, and you name what. Speaking more generally about the project I have in mind, I think that the kind of recurrent theme I think that I'm going to bump into is the following. Whether we should use the DIR versus RAND may crucially depend, I think, on how likely it is that we are able to identify the most relevant reasons or the most relevant factors that determine the strengths of individuals' claim, how reliably we can categorize them, and especially how reliably we can assess these sorts of differences. If we are confident that we can do that, we are in a situation of a DIR type, I think. No matter whether these kind of differences are major or relatively small. If you are in those situations, and I think the point that Greg was making before as well, where even the kind of information we are getting is plagued by severe uncertainty, then this may hamper our ability to identify and reliably assess the strengths of different individuals' claim, or make any kind of such assessment conditional on further auxiliary assumptions regarding the tenability or testability of the available evidence. Then the case for DIR is comparatively weaker, I would say, than the case I will be able to mount in those situations where the information we have is reliable. This is still a first stab reply, because I think, I mean, these kind of projects open really up a whole suite of very intriguing questions, but that's the kind of answer I will give you at this stage of the project. I mean, the kind of aim I have for this specific paper is to really provide this informed evaluation and comparative evaluation of DIR versus RAND with regard to the 6 major arguments that the proponents of RAND have provided so far. There are interesting extensions, I think, down the line, and one of those really pertain to this role of severe uncertainty when it comes to these sorts of information, and our ability to identify and assess the strengths of different individual reasons. And regarded and related to that, and then I'll stop, is also what kind of aggregation models we may use in order to aggregate reasons together. I mean, like what kind of models make more sense, reasons as filters, aggregation of reasons a la Broom, and so on and so forth.
Great, thanks. And a follow-up about Kelly's question. I mean, I think something you didn't say, but could have said also is people hate randomization procedures. You know, most people just find them just totally unbearable. As scientists, you know, there's a lot of work, as you probably know, in assigning grant funding randomly instead of by assessing the quality of the application. Despite the fact that it probably has many virtues, most scientists hate the idea of assessing funding this way. So randomization, for some curious reason, is, at least in the Western world, and I don't have any empirical data to know that generalizes out of, but for many people, it's a very unpleasant way of making a decision. So I think if you're starting to look at political applicability, I think there's a very clear roadblock here for randomization as a way to choose who should get treatment, because in general, people hate this way of assigning important life-changing outcomes, despite the popularity of lottery, surprisingly. But anyway, that's a small piece of data.
Yeah, thanks. And if I'll ever come to this, especially more nitty-gritty psychological, I'll get back to you probably, Edward, on that one.
All right, good. Thank you very much for this lecture. I think we are ending up the semester on a high note. So it's been really wonderful to see you again, and a wonderful lecture. And to all the attendees, so we hope to see you next semester. If you're following the Cognitive Ontology seminar, see you on December 3rd and December 10th for the last 2 keynote lectures. And Roberto, thanks again for joining us today. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, and well, all the best to you all as well. And thanks again for inviting me, Edward. It was great.
Bye.
Bye.